There are so many fascinating Hebrew language insights in Isaiah chapter 7, and I am excited to share them with you. Welcome to Hebrew Bible Insights, a podcast about making sense of the Hebrew Bible. I'm Matthew Delaney. I'm excited for us to dive into Isaiah chapter 7. We did an episode recently about this chapter, talking about the narrative and the historical context for the famous Advent verse from the Hebrew Bible about someone being born who will be called Emmanuel. And today I want to dive into just Hebrew language insights about this whole chapter, because there are many of them, and I don't have time to get even to all the things I've been researching. I want to share everything today with the podcast audience and YouTube in mind. So whether you're listening or watching, I think everyone will be able to follow along. Secondly, I also want to share everything today in a way that people who don't know any Hebrew, people who've done some Hebrew, or people who've done a lot of Hebrew will all get benefit from this experience. One of my favorite ways to engage in Hebrew Bible studies is to read it in the original languages of Hebrew as well as some Aramaic. This is some of my one of my favorite memories. Not just memories, but one of my favorite experiences to this day is getting together with a group of people that we've been meeting for 10 years, just reading the Bible in the original languages. And sometimes what you'll see are stylistic elements that are hard to see in English. And other times there are certain layers and depths of meaning that are also difficult to see in English. And even when there's not really any insights, so to say, it's just still just such a beautiful language, and I love getting to see the script on the page and hear the sounds that it makes. So I'm going to do a number of elements in today's episode that I hope you'll find interesting and valuable. As always, when I edit all these videos, I make chapters and timestamps that you can find below. That way you can skip directly to what adds the most value to you, or you can skip something if that's not interesting to you and easily go right to where you want to go. Without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into Isaiah chapter 7. And at the very beginning of the episode, I just very quickly want to give a brief narrative context. We got to remember that languages are ultimately part of stories, and we don't want to separate the two. J.R. Tolkien, he was famous for making sure that the language and literature departments of Oxford would not separate during his time of study there. And I think that's very wise, because ultimately languages exist because of people and culture and the stories that they tell, but also the stories that people tell happen within cultures, and they use language to do it. So if you want a much deeper dive on this story, I recommend going back in our archive to check out an episode that we did about Isaiah chapter 7 and the story of Emmanuel. But the short version is Isaiah 7 is actually a narrative, which is nice. We don't get that as often as we'd like in some of the poetic prophets. And it's a narrative about a war between Judah and a team up that's happened between Aram and Israel. So Judah's neighbors to the north, Israel, which is their brothers basically, and Aram, which is the place that Jacob met his wife. So his father-in-law is from there, his wife is from there. A lot of old family roots that go back to these regions. Well, Israel and Aram have teamed up, and they're fighting against Judah, and everyone's afraid, and they think that there's no way for them to stand a chance against this war. And in the middle of this war, God sends Isaiah with a message of hope and encouragement and a challenge to believe in the Lord, and that ultimately their enemies will be defeated by a tool that God uses, that being Assyria. And so that's what's going on in the immediate context of Isaiah chapter 7. So now that we have that in mind, we can dive into some Hebrew language insights. So again, I'm going to do this in a way where whether you're listening or watching, you can keep track with everything I'm doing. But if you're very visually oriented, or you want to see what does the language look like, what do these letters look like as I'm showing them, or maybe you're learning Hebrew and maybe you're listening to this podcast on a drive, but later on you can find the clips you want on YouTube to be able to see what I'm showing, because I'm going to show all of my things that I'm doing on accordance, all the resources I'm using, and that way you can see for yourself if you would like. But let's go ahead and check out Isaiah chapter 7. The first thing that I want to do is just read an extensive amount of Isaiah chapter 7 and 8 in Hebrew, just fluidly reading the text. And I will give an English translation I'm just going to use the ESV. It's what I have in front of me. So that way everyone knows what's going on in the text. But the reason I want to do this is I find that there's not enough content, in my opinion, about people just getting to hear not just a phrase or a word or even a verse, but hearing a long portion of what the Hebrew sounds like. This is great for anyone who's learning the language because you need to have different dosage amounts of Hebrew when you're learning. Sometimes you just need to master a phrase or a sentence, but other times you need to take large gulps of the language. Also, I would say this, even if you're not learning Hebrew, I think that it's just a beautiful language and many people would like to hear what the language sounds like. I enjoy doing this with languages that I'm not even studying, that I don't understand. I like it when there are people on YouTube or podcasts who will read some of the language. So I'm going to do that first. And again, if you're not interested in this, you can go to the timestamps and chapters below and jump straight to where I give you the insights. So I'm not going to read the whole chapter. I'm going to read Isaiah 7, 1 through 17, and then jump a little bit ahead to 8, verses 1 through 3. So let's go ahead and read. Vayhi bimei Ahaz ben Yotam ben Uziyahu melech Yehuda ala Retzin melech Aram ufekach ben Remalyahu melech Israel Yerushalayim lamilchama aleha v'lo yachol leilachem aleha. Vayugad lebeit David lemor nacha Aram al Ephraim vayana levavo ulevav amo kenoa atzei ya'ar mipnei ruach. ויאמר אדוני אל ישעיהו, צא לקראת אחז, אתה ושאר-ישוב בניך, אל קצה תעלת הברכה העליונה, אל מסילת שדה חובס. ואמרת אליו, הישמר, והשקט, אל תירא, ולבבך אל ירח משני הזנבות האודים העשנים האלה, בוחרי אף רצין, וארם ובן רמליהו. יען כי יעץ עליך ארם רעה, אפרים ובן רמליהו לאמור, נעלה ויהודה, ונקיצנה, ונפקיענה אלינו, ונמליך מלך בתוכה, את בן תבעל. כה אמר אדוני, אלוהים, לא תקום ולא תהיה, כי ראש ארם דמשק, וראש דמשק רצין, ובעוד 65 שנה, יחת אפרים מעם. וראש אפרים שומרון, וראש שומרון בן רמליהו, אם לא תאמינו, כי לא תאמנו. ויוסף אדוני דבר אל אחז לאמור, שאל לך אות מעם אדוני אלוהיך, המעק שאלה, או הגביה למעלה. ויאמר אחז, לא אשאל, ולא אנסה את אדוני. ויאמר, שמעו נא בית דוד, המעט מכם הלאות אנשים, כי תלאו גם את אלוהי? לכן, ייתן אדוני הוא לכם אות. הנה, העלמה הרע ויולדת בן, וקראת שמו עמנואל. חמאה ודבש יאכל לדעתו מאוס ברע ובחור בטוב. כי בטרם ידע הנער מאוס ברע ובחור בטוב, תעזב האדמה אשר אתה קץ, מפני שני מלכיה. יביא אדוני עליך, ועל עמך, ועל בית אביך, ימים אשר לא באו, למיום סור אפרים, מעל יהודה, את מלך אשור. I'm going to go ahead and read that in English so we understand what's being read here. Beginning in verse 1 again. In the days of Ahaz, the son of Jotham, son of Uzziah, king of Judah, Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, the king of Israel, came up to Jerusalem to wage war against it, but could not yet mount an attack against it. When the house of David was told Syria is in league with Ephraim, the heart of Ahaz and the heart of his people shook, as the trees of the forest shake before the wind. And the Lord said to Isaiah, go out to meet Ahaz, you and Shear-Jashub, your son, at the end of the conduit of the upper pool on the highway to the washer's field, and say to him, be careful, be quiet, do not fear, and do not let your heart be faint, because of these two smoldering stumps of firebrands, at the fierce anger of Rezin and Syria, the son of Remaliah. Because Syria with Ephraim and the son of Remaliah has devised evil against you, saying, let us go up against Judah and terrify it, and let us conquer it for ourselves, and set up the son for Tabeel as king in the midst of it. Thus says the Lord God, it shall not stand, and it shall not come to pass, for the head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin, and within 65 years Ephraim will be shattered from being a people, and the head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is the son of Remaliah. If you are not firm in faith, you will not be firm at all. Again, the Lord spoke to Ahaz, ask for a sign. Ask a sign of the Lord your God. Let it be as deep as Sheol or as high as heaven. But Ahaz said, I will not ask, and I will not put the Lord to the test. And he said, hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary men, that you weary my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. He shall eat curds and honey when he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the boy knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land whose two kings you dread will be deserted. The Lord will bring upon you and upon your people and upon your father's house such days as have not come since the day that Ephraim departed from Judah, the king of Assyria. I'm just going to read three more verses, and now in chapter 8. Then we'll dive into the insights. Chapter 8, verses 1 through 3, first in Hebrew. Vayomer Adonai Elai, kach lecha gilayon gadol, uchtov alav becheret enosh, Maher-Shalal-Hash-Baz, ve'aida li edim ne'emanin, et Uriah HaKohen, ve'et Zechariahu ben Yeverechiahu, va'ekrav el hanevi'ah, v'tahar v'teled ben, vayomer Adonai Elai, kra shmo Maher-Shalal-Hash-Baz. In English, the Lord said to me, take a large tablet and write on it in common characters belonging to Maher-Shalal-Hash-Baz, and I will get reliable witnesses, Uriah the priest and Zechariah the son of Yeverechiah, to attest for me. And I went to the prophetess, and she conceived and bore a son. Then the Lord said to me, call his name Maher-Shalal-Hash-Baz. Right, so that's taking in big gulps of just hearing the Hebrew language and what it sounds like. It's beautiful Hebrew. The style here is excellent. You can tell that this has really been crafted together well in the literary process, how it's all put together. So let's go ahead and dive into some of the insights of what I see. And just so you know, there's no way I can cover everything. There's a lot we can talk about here, everything from wordplay and sound play all the way to textual criticism and everything in between. So I'm just going to show you a few things that stand out to me. So I want to start by pointing out some really interesting wordplay and sound play that happens in Isaiah chapter 7. We did an interview with Dr. Jonathan Klein a number of months ago. You can look in the archive for our interview with him. And he talks about the importance of sound play or wordplay in the Hebrew Bible. And this isn't just unique to the Hebrew-speaking people of the ancient world. We see this throughout the ancient Near East, in Ugarit and Mesopotamia, that having words with similar sounds wasn't just used as a fun, frivolous, or childish way of telling a story, but it was used in very intense, serious moments. So we might have to adjust our expectations of when sound play and wordplay are used in terms of as a literary device. The first one I want to show you is in the phrase that actually has a fun little imagery going on here in verse 2, where it says, when the house of David was told, Syria is in league with Ephraim, the heart of Ahaz and the heart of his people shook as the trees of the forest shake before the wind. Without even looking at Hebrew, this is already fun. This communication style, they don't just say, hey, they're really scared or they were terrified. We get a metaphor here. Now, what you won't be able to see in English, though, is this line is filled with a specific letter in Hebrew that creates some sound play. Another example of sound play that you may have heard if you listen to our interview with Dr. Lena Sophia Tiemeyer is the beginning of Isaiah 40, which signals a huge message of comfort and hope, begins with Nachamu, Nachamu, Ami. And she pointed out how the sound in languages almost all around the world are used for how they refer to the mother, which is a comforting sound. And so she points out that intentionality. In Hebrew, the letter Ayin is not pronounced in modern Hebrew, which is the pronunciation I use, although you will run into plenty of Israelis who can make the sound or will make the sound if they're maybe reading scripture, or if you have people who have more of a Mizrahi accent, which is a really popular music style in Israel, they will pronounce the Ayin. Anyway, so you're not going to hear it whenever I say it, but I'm going to point it out to you. In the second part of this verse, what we have is Vayana levavo ulevav amo kenoa atse ya'ar mipnei ruach. So if you're watching on YouTube, you'll see the word Vayana, which is and he shook, that being the people though, or that being Ahaz. And Ahaz shook, that word for shook, his heart and the heart of Amo, his people. That word also has an ayin. So far in the second half of the verse, we have 4 words. 2 words have ayin. And the next 3 words are going to have ayin as well. So we have kenoa, as something shakes, and we'll find out later what's shaking. Atse ya'ar, atse, trees of, ya'ar, forest. So the word for shake, people, shake, trees, and forest all have the letter ayin in it. So that's quite a bit. And I think there's an interesting little sound play going on there. And then the next one is actually the very following verse, which is kind of interesting. This next verse where God says, Vayomer Adonai el Yeshayahu, and the Lord said to Isaiah, what he tells him, we have so many alepphs here in what he first says. So it's interesting to hear, by the way, aleph and ayin are both guttural letters. And we don't know exactly what sound they would have made, but some theorize the aleph was like a glottal stop, whereas the ayin was more of a glottal constriction of the throat. And so you can imagine that sort of guttural sound kind of really breaking through. What God says to Isaiah, the first one, depends if you consider not a second word. The Massoretes kind of connect them to view as one, but we'll count them as separate here. The first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 words of what God says, all of them have an aleph in there. And again, this is a silent letter in modern Hebrew, so you're not going to hear it when I say it. But if you look at the text, you'll see it. Tsena likrat Ahaz, ata u'sha'ar Yashuv. Then you finish his name. Yashuv does not have an aleph. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 all have an aleph. So I'm going to be very clear. I'm not saying there's some like code going on here. It's just interesting sound play that we have going on. It's almost like we have these ayins of anxiety, versus these alephs of assurance that are going on between the fear of the people and this message of hope that God's about to give. And you have this repeated, this sound, just boom, 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 versus da 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 da. All right, there's one more element of sound play that I want to point out, which happens when the king of Israel and Aram, when they're conspiring against Judah, we have their words, Na'ale vihuda, let us go up against Judah. And in ESV, what they say is, and terrify it, and let us conquer it. So that word for terrify and conquer, they appear back to back, unikitsena vinavkiena. And you can probably hear how they rhyme in some ways. They both end in na. That's referring to what they're going to conquer. Na referring to her, that being Judah. But the verbs themselves, they both begin with the n sound, the noon, because that's the way in Hebrew you have like we are going to do something or let us do something. And then the rest of the verbs, we have nikitsena and navkiena. So we both have not just a noon, but also the kuf, that K sound. The second verb also has the letter bet, or here v for vet, not in the first verb. But what we also have, and this is helpful when you understand Aramaic, is that the first verb has a ts, nikitsena, that top hat sound. And the next verb has navkiena. Underneath before that sound is our letter ayin, which is silent in modern Hebrew pronunciation. But we know that in the West Semitic world, that there came a point where certain sounds would be almost interchangeable or intermixed because of how different people groups hear the sounds. And Some that we see interchanged is ein, kuf, and tzadi. Ein, kuf, and tzadi. And both of these words contain kuf, and then one has tzadi, one has ein. So to give you an example of how this works, the perfect word to illustrate this is the word aretz. And aretz is a word for earth, like in Genesis 1. Aretz. Well, when you read Aramaic, the Aramaic version of aretz, often what you'll see is either ar-a or ar-ka. And that last ah sound there is like the definite article for Aramaic, but it tends to be a determinative, and they just kind of put it on there almost all the time when you read biblical Aramaic. And so we have arka is that kuf. The kuf is almost replacing, you could say, the tzadi. Or ar-a, there's an ein, ar-a, if you will. There's an ein that's right there that it's replacing. And you'll see both spellings in Aramaic within the Hebrew Bible. So what we have is the two words that these people are saying that we're going to do, let's terrify it and conquer it. Like they sound so similar, and it kind of has an interesting effect. Again, going back to literary devices here, of piling on this terrifying, conquering plan that they have. Okay, so that's the end of talking about some of the sound play and wordplay. Let's go to one of the really interesting words that's spoken. When God tells Isaiah, go speak to Ahaz, here's the message I have for you to tell him. The very first word that God has him say, we see in verse 4, is the word hishamer, which in ESV here says, they translate as be careful. And the rest of the phrase is be quiet, do not fear, and do not let your heart be faint. That's the beginning of the instruction that he gives him. Now, this word is interesting because hishamer, the root is very common, shamar, or to use an American accent, shamar. Shamar is a very common root in Hebrew. What we have here, though, is the nephal, one of the stems of biblical Hebrew, as well as modern, and it's the imperative. This specific form here only appears 18 times in the entire Hebrew Bible. And what's interesting is the vast majority of those times are in the book of Deuteronomy. 8 times in the book of Deuteronomy, we have this same phrasing that happens. So let's check out just a few of those instances that you have in Deuteronomy, where we have Deuteronomy 6:12, which begins with hishamer, English, then take care lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Now you're going to notice a theme where this word appears in Deuteronomy. It's used in context about making sure you take care and make sure that you guard yourself so that you will actually follow the one true God, so that you will follow the Lord, and him alone you will serve. This might also be helpful to note that the root shamar is also used in biblical texts to talk about keeping or guarding the commands of God. So we might not notice that in English, that what does being careful have to do with guarding and keeping? Well, in Hebrew, it's the same semantic range in this word. Deuteronomy 8:11 also begins with hishamer. Take care lest you forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments and his rules and his statutes, which I command you today. Deuteronomy 12:13. Take care that you do not offer your burnt offerings at any place that you see. And again, the verse continues, and this has to do with worshiping God in the way that he commands to. Deuteronomy 12:19. Take care that you do not neglect the Levite as long as you live in your land. Take care of the people who are doing God's unique work. Deuteronomy 12:30. Hishamer again. Take care that you be not ensnared to follow them after they have been destroyed before you, and that you do not inquire about their gods, saying, how did these nations serve their gods? That I also may do the same, talking about whenever you go and inherit the land, don't follow after their gods. Deuteronomy 15:9, also hishamer. Take care lest there be an unworthy thought in your heart, and you say, the 7th year, the year of release is near, and your eye look grudgingly on your poor brother, and you give him nothing. And he cried to the Lord against you, and you be guilty of sin. This has to do with the importance of generosity in the Hebrew culture that God wanted to instill among them. And then last one, Deuteronomy 24:8. Take care in a case of leprous disease to be very careful to Do according to all the Levitical priests shall direct you as I commanded them, so you shall be careful to do. So we notice that hishamer, this specific form, the Nephal imperative, is used often to talk about making sure you follow the one true God and follow his ways. It's not just used in context like, hey, be careful, watch out. Although it can be used in that type of context, like 2 Kings 6:9. But the man of God sent word to the king of Israel, beware that you do not pass this place, for the Syrians are going down there. Syrians actually referring to Aram as well. So what type of meaning is being intended here by the Lord through Isaiah? Is this more, hey, be careful, you're in a war situation like 2 Kings 6:9. Be careful, make sure you're aware of what enemies might be around. Like that's possible. But I think as we'll see in the context of Isaiah, I think that the Deuteronomist messaging about being faithful to the one true God and putting your trust and hope in him, I think that's what makes the most sense, because first off, the rest of the command is v'hashket al tira ulevavcha al yerach, which is not just be careful, or let's say take care, but be quiet. Do not fear. Do not let your heart be faint because of these two smoldering stumps of firebrands. So I think it's more about, hey, trust in God. And if you're not totally tracking yet, just wait. We're going to get more insights later, and we'll see how the message really lays out there. So that's the first thing related to Hishamer I wanted to point out, is I think as the case will develop here, that Isaiah is really, the main point is trust in God. Follow him. He is your Lord. Remember your covenant. That's what he's calling Ahaz to do. Now, as you see later, Ahaz, he doesn't take this seriously for whatever reason. Let me show you one other thing. It just so happens to be very interesting what God tells Isaiah to say, Hishamer, because we actually have an ancient inscription from the kingdom of Judah, which is very rare. We do not have that many inscriptions from ancient Israel, unfortunately. We have Sumerian ostraca, we have the Lachish ostraca, as well as, a lot of seals, but we don't have much stuff we've dug up in the dirt that dates back to ancient Israel. Now, I'm not talking about Dead Sea Scrolls. That's much later than the era we're talking about here. If you want to talk about Iron Age Israel, or even Bronze Age Israel, that's like during the Kingdom of Israel or before, we have very little to work with. But we have some ostraca that date to the time period of about the late 7th, early 6th century. So that being like the late 600s, early 500s, right before the Babylonian exile. We have what appears to be correspondence, this pottery that may have been used actually for practicing the writing before they officially sent it on a different piece of writing, that some of these military commanders are communicating with each other. And we have, in a book called Echoes from the Past, an excellent work by Shmuel Achituv, where he's put all of these inscriptions together from the West Semitic world that are really, I think, really helpful. All right, I'm going to go ahead and read part of the letter that I think is relevant for us. This is Shmuel Achituv's translation at the very end. He says, "And as for the letter of Toviyahu, the servant of the king, which came to Shallum, the son of Yadua, from the prophet, saying, be on guard. Your servant is sending it to my Lord." So when we look at this in Hebrew up here, what he has is Me'et Hanavi, from the prophet, Lemor, saying, Hishamer. Hishamer. It's an exact same word that Isaiah uses. Now, there might not be any connection to this, because like we said, Hishamer can be used, hey, be careful, be on guard. We have no other context to this letter. There's no other words that he says from the prophet. All he says, hey, be careful. They're in the middle of a war. Could he be saying, hey, keep on guard, kind of like the 2 Kings 6:9 verse? Hey, we're in the middle of a battle, watch out. Kings would often seek out prophets to say, hey, should I go to war or not? Will we win this or not? So that's all it could be. But, who knows? Maybe Isaiah's famous message in Isaiah chapter 7 which again, that hishamer, that word, it doesn't appear that often in the Bible, only 18 times. And maybe Isaiah using it in that famous story that would have happened before this Lachish correspondence could have been so inspiring that it became one of the ways that the prophets referred to the idea of, hey, it's a really short code basically for, not maybe code, that's probably the wrong word, but maybe it's just also loaded with some of that connotation and connection to covenant faithfulness to the Lord and taking care in how you're approaching your life, even in this kind of war. It's all conjecture. We don't know the context. There's a lot we're missing here. But at the very least, just know it's interesting that we happen to have this word from a prophet that we've dug up from archaeology in the time of Israel's history. I think it's really cool. All right, let's go on to the next thing here. This is really important. One of the things that's spoken in Isaiah 7, chapter 4, if we finish this verse, is, and do not let your heart be faint because of these two smoldering stumps of firebrands at the fierce anger of Rezin and Syria, the son of Remaliah. So what God is saying here is, don't let your heart be faint against these two nobodies. Yeah, they look like a fire, but they're just smoldering stumps of firebrands. Before you know it, their fire is going to get put out. And this imagery continues because later on he describes Assyria as a flood. So it's going to come out. These little stumps on fire are going to get totally put out. What's really interesting, though, is the word that is translated here in the ESV as stump or stumps, which is zanvot. If you compare English translations, which is one good way of seeing, hey, is there something going on here in the original language? There are a lot of different translations for this word in this verse. I'd be curious what your favorite translation uses. A number of translations will use things like stumps, torches, sticks, ends, bits, stubs, or tails, which tails is the one that stands out from the rest. If this is a multiple choice test, you're like, it can't be tails because that one's like totally on its own. The rest are more synonyms. Let's figure out which one of those it is. Well, what's really important is it's really important for us to know that zanvot, normally it refers to things like tails. Now remember, semantic range, languages can have words that refer to different types of things we might often separate that they don't view separately. But either way, again, my goal is not to find the best translation for the word in this verse. But if we don't know what this word, this semantic range, what it means, we're going to miss a really important connection. So when you look at this word zanvot, which doesn't appear often in the Hebrew Bible, this word appears 11 times in the entire Hebrew Bible. The first time we have it is in Exodus 4:4. But the Lord said to Moses, put out your hand and catch it by the tail. Okay, biznavo, by its tail. So he put out his hand and caught it, and it became a staff in his hand, the famous scene where God says, throw out the staff, it becomes a serpent, grab by the tail, then it becomes a staff again. So that's a clear instance where it means tail. Now, what's the important connection I want you to see is that this is used twice in Deuteronomy 28, a really important part of this covenant code, this covenant treaty, where we have the sections of the blessings and the curses. In Deuteronomy 28:13, he says, and the Lord will make you the head and not the tail. And you shall only go up and not down if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you today, being careful to do them. So that word there, the tail, is lezanav. Unitancha Adonai lerosh velo lezanav. And the Lord will make you the head, not the tail. So referring to, you will be the ones to have victory. When you obey the Lord is on your side. He is your God. He is your Father. He is your King. He is your Lord. Put your trust in him, and you will have victory, is basically what it's saying to the Hebrew people. In Deuteronomy 28:44, another instance, he shall lend to you, and you shall not lend to him. He shall be the head, and you shall be the tail. So this is showing like the opposite side of things, where and toward like the curse section, you aren't going to be experiencing great. He shall be the head, and you shall be the tail this time is enough. So you don't want to be the tail. You want to be the head. So what's important is not just understanding that this word can mean tail in these specific verses, but knowing the role that Deuteronomy plays as this, um, as this covenant treaty, basically, is what it is, and saying, be faithful to the one true God. So when Isaiah is saying this message to Ahaz, this is where you'll see the argument continues to build for Hishamer, more having this take care in the Deuteronomy sense of the usage about being faithful to the Lord. Because what he's saying is, hey, remember the covenant with me. My covenant, you are the head, not the tail. If you will obey and keep my commands, if you will follow me, if you'll put your trust in me, that's the key. And this is another echo of that. But you wouldn't make that connection if you're only reading in English, because you're just going to see the word stump. Okay, so the next insight actually flows right in line with this, I think. There's a really famous wordplay that we see in the book of Isaiah. It might be the most famous wordplay of the whole Hebrew Bible. You'll often see this in textbooks. The moment where they say, let's talk about word and sound play in the Hebrew Bible, this is probably the first one they will show you, where God is saying, hey, put your trust in me. And then there's a section where he describes the head of Ephraim is Samaria, or the head of Aram is Damascus, head of Damascus is Rezin. I think what he's basically saying there is, hey, it's me, the Lord Almighty, versus your enemy is Aram. And what is Aram but like their capital city? And who's over their capital? This human ruler. What do they compare to me? At the very end, he says this, which the ESV, I think, does a really good job capturing the wordplay in English. If you are not firm in faith, you will not be firm at all. What is it in Hebrew? In Hebrew, that part sounds like this. Im lo ta'aminu, ki lo te'amenu. So the key words we're looking at is ta'aminu and te'amenu. In Hebrew, both of these words are the same root. It's aman. They both begin with tav, and that's just a prefix that's letting you know it's a second person verb here. This is the imperfect or the yiktol conjugation, and they both end in u, which is also interesting. I want to point out in a second. But the main thing here is this: we have the same root. So the word ta'aminu, which is the he feel of the root aman, it means to believe or to trust. And then we have the nifal, te'amenu. Nifals tend to be passive. So te'amenu, it can be like to be trustworthy, okay, or to be faith, something that is like faithful, full of faithfulness, that you should believe in it, but it can also refer to something just being firm and established. So that's where the word play is. Im lo ta'aminu, ki lo te'amenu. And this is a powerful point of Isaiah's speech. The first kind of delivery of words ends with this right here. And it ends with this call, trust in God. But if you do not trust in him, if you do not believe in him, then you will not be firm. So again, this is very covenant type language. And we're seeing multiple layers of this happening in this very short but powerful speech by Isaiah. Really powerful words. So something else I want to show you with this really cool phrase is this same language shows up in one of the last books of the Hebrew Bible, that being Chronicles. Gets a lot of bad rap as just the cheap repeat of Kings, but it's very different purpose, written much later. If you compare Isaiah 7:9, im lo ta'aminu, ki lo te'amenu, if you are not firm in faith, you'll not be firm at all. In 2 Chronicles 20, we have a story where there's a war that's happening, and King Jehoshaphat speaks to the people, trying to encourage them to faith with God. He says, hear me, Judah and inhabitants of Jerusalem. Believe in the Lord your God, and you will be established. Believe his prophets, and you will succeed. Now, in English, what we see is the difference is firm in faith versus Chronicles believe, and not be firm versus you will be established. In English, you wouldn't guess that these are actually using the same words. So in Hebrew, what we see is, he says, ha'aminu b'Adonai Elohechem v'te'amenu ha'aminu v'nevi'av v'hatzlichu. So the first word is ha'aminu. It doesn't sound like ta'aminu because it's a different form of the verb. The ta'aminu is an imperfect, whereas this one's an imperative. But it's the same word. It's the he feel of aman, believe. And the next one is te'amenu. And that one is actually the exact same form, even. But to have this exact same wordplay appear in this section, it's hard to not think there's got to be some connection here. We have it in the Chronicles version. So, this could be an example of kind of literary influence where the author of Chronicles, who's writing this after the exile, is inspired by Isaiah's communication style. And this could be a way of communicating this inspiring message of Jehoshaphat. Now, you could also say that, this is what he said to begin with. But it's just, however Kings tells the story or not, it's just not included, whatever. However you want to look at it, just this is a really interesting connection that's worth noting. So I'd be curious for you guys, if you were to reflect more on this text and read these two stories in connection with each other, what do you see? Would love to see some thoughts in the comments below. One last point that I want to make is Isaiah is speaking to the king, to Ahaz, but in verse 9, and also later in verse 13, he switches to plural instead of singular. Again, something you wouldn't see in English. Which is really interesting because there are two really key points of the text where the first part he's calling Ahaz to believe, but he switches to plural. In verse 13, this is after we've seen that Ahaz is like, oh, I don't want to test God. I'm not going to ask. Isaiah says, hey, God says ask for a sign that God's going to do his part. He's like, oh, no, I don't want to test God. It's this fake religious attitude that he's putting on. What Isaiah says to him, hear, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary men that you weary my God also? So house of David could be referring to Ahaz and the whole court potentially. But it's interesting at these 2 points, why go plural? And I think one element is that this really brings the whole reader audience in. Because again, why do you preserve these stories? Not just because of what they meant, but also what they continue to mean. And also think about this, that Isaiah's words were written down, even though they were spoken to the king, ultimately they're supposed to inspire everyone. And this is a part where we're all maybe supposed to take ownership. And that's kind of the point of why switching to plural for the whole group audience. All of us should take on that responsibility and that ownership to say, I am going to believe as well. I'm going to be firm in my faith, knowing that God will establish me. And I am not going to be one who doesn't just weary people, but wearies God because of my lack of faith. So I think that's the message that is being spoken to the people of in the book of Isaiah. Hey, quick shameless plug for our Hebrew Bible book club that we started recently. This is our community on Patreon that meets monthly to do deep Hebrew Bible studies together. And it's a way for you to support the content that we make as well with all the projects that we are working on. So you can get new content monthly where you can join us live, or you can check out the recordings of past content that's exclusively on Patreon. So thank you for all that you guys do to support our content, whether that's joining the Hebrew Bible Book Club, supporting us on Patreon, or if it's just watching and listening more of our content and sharing with other people that you think it adds value to. So let's go ahead and dive back into looking more in Isaiah. All right, let's look at one last component, which is really interesting in this story, names. I love looking at names in the Hebrew Bible. They're very interesting. Often in the Semitic world, you'll find that names are sentences. They're often the vocalization might adjust a little bit, but basically there's often a verb or a noun or an adjective paired with something else. Often you'll have like a theophoric element, like whatever their deity is, plus some sort of verb saying their deity did this thing, or a noun, my deity is this to me. And we see this throughout Israel as well. And sometimes this happens in ways that are very intentional for the narrative. If you read Isaiah 8:18, Isaiah says, behold, I and the children whom the Lord has given me are signs and portents in Israel from the Lord of hosts who dwells in Mount Zion. And when you read the story of Isaiah 7-8, you see that Isaiah and his sons and the meanings of their names are very important to the story. So we'll start first with Isaiah. Yeshayahu comes from Yesha and Yahu. Yahu being the theophoric element, being part of that word, part of the name Yahweh, basically. So the Lord. And Yesha is coming from Yesha, which means saves. So it means Yahweh saves. And that fits so many contexts of Israelite history, of course, but it's very fitting that Isaiah would have this message, that his name is ultimately saying, hey, Yahweh saves. And, in Isaiah's immediate context, he's going to save you from Aram and Israel. And, as we point to Isaiah being such an important book for the future connected to the New Testament, we see that so much of Isaiah's message is about the idea that the Lord will save. In fact, the name Jesus is also playing off of the same root that Isaiah's name does. They both are playing on the phrase yasha, for to save. So anyway, there's an interesting connection there. The Isaiah is more straightforward, great name. Not trying to read too much into that one, but it's right there. The other one is interesting. In Isaiah 7:3, he says, "Go out to meet Ahaz, you and Shear-Jashub, your son." Why does he have his son come here? That's worth a whole nother discussion later, another episode probably. But his name, Shear-Jashub, means a remnant will return. And that is a really common theme in the Hebrew Bible. We see this all the time, where the prophets will talk about that judgment is coming. If you continue to go in your ways, there'll be an exile. But even so, God, there's a remnant that he chooses. There's a righteous remnant that he preserves and will work through. It's kind of like the Noah story. There's a principle there that's a microcosm example where, yeah, the whole world's evil, but hey, there's Noah and his family. There's a remnant. And then through them, God's going to continue to work about his plans to save the world. Shear-Jashub. So that's a really cool name that his son has. That's an interesting connection. So the main name that we see that's huge is Emmanuel, which in Hebrew, this is in Isaiah 7:14, how the Lord's going to give a sign, and this young woman's going to give birth, and his name's going to be called, the child, Emmanuel. God is with us. Imanu meaning with us. Im is with. The anu part makes it us. So with us, and then El is God. So God is with us. And again, the sign is, hey, you will not lose in this war. God's going to save you. And in the other episode, again, I highly recommend going back in the archive to check out the episode that I recorded about Isaiah chapter 7. I believe it's released in December of 2023, and you can check out the significance of how this plays Emmanuel, the meaning of Emmanuel, and this message plays both for 8th century BCE and 1st century CE. So in Isaiah 7, okay, he's going to be called Emmanuel, but we see in chapter 8, he gets a different name. So in Isaiah chapter 8, verse 3, we then see what the child ends up being named, a different name, which again is not, ironically, that also fits the pattern of the New Testament. Again, I'll recommend the previous episode, but sticking to Hebrew insights here is, and I went to the prophetess, and she conceived and bore a son. Now, a quick note here, Va'ekrav el hanivi'ah. This phrase, karav, which means to come close or to approach, this is used in stories to refer to sexual encounters. So that's why one of the theories is that this son, Maher-Shalal-Hash-Baz, the one who's talked about, is Isaiah's son. And that also makes sense of Isaiah 8:18 that I read earlier, where Isaiah says, "Me and my sons are signs." So a lot of it points to the idea that this child that was prophesied, that the 8th century, what's going on there is this is about the Emmanuel here is about Isaiah's son. And of course, that has interesting implications and connections for the New Testament. All right, so, and I went to the prophetess, and she conceived and bore a son. Then the Lord said to me, call his name Maher-Shalal-Hash-Baz. This guy wins the award for maybe the longest name in the Hebrew Bible. I haven't double-checked that, but it's a 4-word name. And the words are actually split apart. Okay, kind of like Emmanuel, similar thing going on there. Maher-Shalal-Hash-Baz. So you can kind of divide these 4 words into 2 pairings. Maher-Shalal-Hash-Baz. And halot, this is a famous lexicon for the Hebrew Bible, gives a really great definition for this guy's name, where they say the spoil speeds, the prey hastens. The spoil speeds, the prey hastens. And it's basically saying that, hey, these enemies of yours, they're about to become spoil for a different army, that being the Assyrian Empire. Okay. The prey hastens. That is, again, Assyria is coming after its prey. So it's coming close to that time. So that's what his name means. So it's ultimately a message of hope for Israel, for Judah, because Israel and Aram are going to get, their enemies are going to get wrecked by Assyria that God is using. Okay, 2 other names I want to talk about. This first one is the second to last one. This is an interesting one that actually involves a little bit of textual criticism. There's some other thoughts I thought would be interesting textual criticism wise, but there's just not enough time for all the insights I wanted to share, so I cut some of those out. This one in Isaiah 7:6, where it says, "Let us go up against Judah and terrify it, and let us conquer it for ourselves, and set up the son of," in English we see Tabeel as king in the midst of it. So what's interesting here we have is basically, hey, let's conquer this place, and then we'll put in our own ruler to rule that area. Not at all an uncommon practice in the ancient Near East or in just the broader ancient world. That, hey, we're going to rule this place. We'll have a little puppet king that we'll put there, or maybe an ally, suppose, whatever. It's just someone else is going to rule there. And this word in Hebrew, when you look at it in the Masoretic text, it's tav al, which the first part tav, that's kind of like basically the Hebrew word tov, and then which means good, and then al is a negation word, something about no or not. And again, I love how halot, they give it kind of an idiomatic translation, calling it good for nothing. That's basically what his name means. More literally, his name basically means not good. Okay. And they give it a good for nothing. So let's put up the son of good for nothing as king in the midst of it. So what's going on here? Like, who in the world, whose mother would name their child good for nothing? Like, that's just a ridiculous name. And it's caused commentators to wonder what's going on here. I read an interesting one that I want to do some more research into, but something it's an intentional skewing of a name of the son of a king in Tyre in the area of Phoenicia, who from an area of Tabeel, I think. I'll have to look back at my notes. Etobaal, and basically taking some of those. And we know about this guy because of an Assyrian list of people who gave contributions. So we know some of the rulers during this time period. And the name has a lot of the same sounds that this Hebrew name has. And so maybe they had in mind someone from Tyre that they were going to move into that position. And maybe the authors of scripture or the editors wanted to not give him any honor and wanted to, switch up the sounds of his name and with some intense word sound play into a Hebrew word for good for nothing. So I want to do some more digging into that theory. I think it's at least interesting one to hear about. If you want to just dive in and you're impatient on me getting back to it at some point, you can check out the Hermeneia commentary on First Isaiah, and he has a good paragraph as well as linking some sources there. But what other option is there? Well, this is a name in the Hebrew Bible that we see again in Ezra 4:7, and there's a list of officials here, and one of them is Tabeel in English. This one's a little more tricky to figure out where are these people exactly from and where do their names originate from. But Tabeel here, it's the exact same 4 consonants in Hebrew, but one of the vowels is different. And the vowels, again, that's coming from the Masoretes. They point this one as Tav El, which is a very different meaning, because Tav is still good, related to Tov, but the El part is God. So instead of not good, this means God is good, or El is good. Totally different meaning. Now, what's interesting, though, when you look at the Septuagint translation, which this work is happening before the turn of the Common Era, we can see how they vocalize things. In fact, the Septuagint is a helpful resource for us understanding vocalization of some of these ancient Semitic languages, but particularly Hebrew, for our purposes, because when they translate names and places, generally they're not translating the meaning, they're translating the sounds. And even though there's always limitations and challenges that happen when you try to translate sounds, like, for example, Beit Lechem into Bethlehem, in English, there's no ch sound, right? So we lose that. But generally, it gives us at least some sort of clue of how they're vocalizing things. And what you'll notice is that the Septuagint for Isaiah 7:6, the vowel that's given for the al part is epsilon eta. And then the same vowels are also used in Ezra 4:7 for the name. We have epsilon eta. So These two Hebrew names, although they're vocalized differently in the Masoretic text, they're not vocalized differently in the Septuagint. So what could be going on is that this guy's name could have actually been Tav-El. That's not uncommon. We actually have Toviyahu in the actually in the Ostraca that I read you guys earlier from the Echoes from the Past. That would be an example of Yahweh is good. And so we have that sort of naming happening in these centuries in Judah, where we have the adjective good followed by the theophoric element, whether God or Yahweh, Yahu or El. And so, that it could just be that, or again, maybe this still could be a foreign person, but know that El is also a theophoric element for people outside of Judah and Israel, referring to not just Yahweh. So even if it's a foreign person, that could be fine. They would do that. And so what you have then is basically Tav-Al is just the Masoretes changing that one vowel. Because again, they don't want this guy to be known as God is good, because this is somebody who they're trying to put as ruler over us. And this is not a sign of God's goodness. This, whoever this person is, they're trying to instate as ruler, as a puppet king, is terrible. And we're going to call him good for nothing. So there's multiple theories, different layers, different things to take a look at. At the very least, know that there's a guy that at the very least, according to the Masoretes, the way they vocalize things, they want him to be remembered as good for nothing, even if his name was originally more something like Ito Baal from another Semitic language, or if his name was Tav-El, meaning God is good. That's not how the Masoretes want him to be remembered. I think it's just a hilarious name. All right, let's go to the last name. And this is one I actually was not even going to include. But after, as you know, I've been doing some work with Shmuel Achituv for some other projects, as well as this one. And looking at the Ostraca, he makes an interesting comment on the name Ahaz, not because he's commenting on the story, but it's because it's a word that appears in our inscriptions. And so he comments on any of the words that appear, any names that appear in inscriptions. And if we remember, Isaiah is trying to call the king of Judah to actually be faithful to the Lord and to trust in him, because God, he is faithful to his covenant, but put your trust in him. But if you don't believe in him, you're not going to be firm at all. And we see that Ahaz, unfortunately, he doesn't want to put his faith and trust in God. Now, God's still faithful and he still protects Judah in this time. But Ahaz is very different from his son Hezekiah that shows up later in the book of Isaiah. And so what's interesting is when we think about what Ahaz's name means. So Isaiah 7:2 is just a random verse. His name appears in a lot of verses, but this one's ironic for it. When the house of David was told Syria or Aram is in league with Ephraim, that being referring to Israel, the heart of Ahaz and the heart of his people shook as the trees of the forest shake before the wind. Ahaz had a lot of fear. He was very afraid, and God wanted to give a message of hope. So Ahaz, let me show you the comment that Shmuel Achituv gives for Ahaz. He says that Ahaz is a hypocoristic, which is like a diminutive, from a name like Achaziyahu. This is a common thing you'll see in Hebrew. Many times we have, like, for example, my podcast co-host, our resident scholar, Dr. Nathan French, his name is Natan, which is a diminutive of probably El Natan, which is a word that also so many connections to our Lachish Ostraca earlier. El Natan also is in that letter. So Natan would just mean he gives or he gave, and El Natan makes it God gave. But often we just find names start getting shortened. In fact, that's what Jesus' name is. Yeshua, it's a shortened form of Yehoshua. So a common thing we see. So that's where he says it's a shortened form of a name like Achaziyahu. So this takes the word Ahaz, which in Hebrew means to hold, to grasp, or to seize, or a variety of other things. So that's the gist of it. But now it's Yahweh is holding. So Shmuel Achituv's comment is Yahweh held the child's hand to help him. Is kind of the idea. It's also helpful to know Shmuel Achituv, he talks a lot about, especially in ancient Near East, you see a lot of times where the person's relationship to their God is referred to in very family terms. We've talked a lot about divine sonship on our podcast and our Hebrew Bible book club on Patreon. But what he sees is it's like Yahweh holding the hand of a child to help him. And he compares this to Psalm 73:23. Va'ani tamid imach is the first part, but then it says, Achasta b'yad yamini, you held my right hand. So what's the point? A quick preface, I'm not trying to get people to overread into names of the Bible as if they always have some sort of meaning. But even then, it's like, hey, why does it have that meaning? Is it totally a literary convention where they're making up a name for somebody? Or is it a mixture of the two where this guy's name was this, but authors and editors kind of changed the name a little bit for the story? Or is there something going on where the parent chose a name really intentionally for a reason, or where God told someone, name your kid this? There's all sorts of reasons why a name could be there. And I'm not, Ahaz, I don't know what it could be, but just at least just a thought experiment here. That Ahaz, whose name originally has something to do with the idea of Yahweh holding the hand of someone, and I like Achituv pointing it to the Yahweh holding a child's hand to help him. That's what God is trying to do with Ahaz. He's saying, hey, hold my hand. Trust me. Your enemies can't do anything against you. To give you a silly story, my son and I and my wife, we love getting to go walks to a park. And my wife was at work, so my son and I went to the park by ourselves. And there are these geese, these ducks that he loves seeing, but there are these really mean swans that are also in the area. And my son was walking on his own. He's like, 14 months old, just walking around. And these swans get so angry and they like decide they want to go charge him. But I pick up my son and I let those swans know, you are not going to get my son. The Lord wants Ahaz to know, remember our covenant. I am your God. I am your Lord. I am your Father. I am your Savior. Put your trust in me. Your enemies will not be able to do anything against you. But Ahaz, he rejects the hand of God. So as we reflect on this entire story of Isaiah 7-8, and we think about the different layers of this text, so much is pointing to a message that is, remember your covenant with God. Remember that he is faithful. So if we look at this text as Christians and thinking about the message of the New Testament, that we put our hope and our faith in Jesus, who has saved us. And so if you allow me to get a little pastoral for a minute, whether we are full of shame and guilt in our life and past sin, but are we putting our trust in the work of Jesus Christ on the cross and through the resurrection? If we're doubting the hope for our future, where is our faith and hope in the ascension of Jesus and him sending the Holy Spirit, that we are not alone, that God is with us as we move forward in our life? Let's be the type of people who will say, as for me and my house, me and my family, we will trust God. We trust Jesus. We trust the covenant relationship that we have with him because of what he has done. And to the best of our ability, we will follow his teachings. We will follow his ways as we are empowered by the Holy Spirit to accomplish those things, to live those things out, to live a life of love, full of the fruits of the Spirit. And all the way we can be inspired by stories like what's happening in Isaiah chapter 7, an 8th century message that's still relevant for today. Thanks for joining me for today's episode. I would love to see your comments below, what thoughts that you have. And if you're interested in more, you can find us on podcast platforms and YouTube. You can also join our Hebrew Bible Book Club that's on Patreon, link in the description below, if you want to support the content we do and join our Hebrew Bible Book Club there. We'd love to see you in our deep dive studies that we do on Patreon. Thanks for joining me for today's conversation, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.